Hey everyone, I'm Melissa from Knitting the Stash, and this is episode 88 in the series. Welcome, it is lovely to see you guys, and it is a beautiful day outside. I can see sunshine out my window, and it'll be a good day to get out there with the dogs and the cats and run around and play in some leaves. And fall is in full swing here. We've just turned the clocks back in the United States, so we gained an hour, and yeah, whatever one thinks about the time changes. I mean, I'm all for gaining an hour, I guess. I'm anti-losing an hour. Anyway, welcome to the podcast. I think the hour kind of messes with my head. So welcome back if you're a returning viewer. It's lovely to see you, and I've enjoyed all the messages and the Ravelry boards, and trying to keep up with all of you guys. So if I haven't gotten back to you, I'll do my best to get back to you. And if you're new to the podcast, welcome. It's a podcast about knitting and garment design and garment modification, mostly with a little spinning thrown in there. And we've been doing a knitting history segment, and I have one of those for you guys today, so it should be kind of fun. So let's see, what else do I tell you about myself? I'm coming to you from Urbana, Illinois. I'm a professor at the university there. I teach a lot of science fiction and science, technology studies kind of stuff. So this yarn room has been converted into my classroom, which is very bizarre, but it's been working out. And yeah, and today I have a whole new sweater for you, so it's kind of an exciting day on the podcast. If you're looking for me anywhere, you can find me just about everywhere as Knitting the Stash, and that's obviously on YouTube, on Instagram, Ravelry, and over on the blog, which is knittingthestash.wordpress.com, and that's where I put all the show notes, so anything I mention here, the links will be over there, and you can check them out that way. So what do I have for you today? I have a finished cardigan. This is actually a sweater that I finished last spring for Albina of LB Handknits. It was a test knit, and I get to finally talk to you about it, so that's exciting. And I wanted to talk to you guys about being in progress as a knitter, and it's one of the things I'm not as good at in my public life as a knitter. I often show off finished things. I don't always talk so much about things as they're in process, and so I thought it might be fun to kind of think about that and talk about that a little bit, along with the design that I'm working on. I've been trying to put that out there a little bit more and talk about the kind of progress and decision-making moments and that kind of stuff. So that'll be part of the podcast. And then I have a knitting history segment for you guys, thanks to a couple of viewers who sent in some really cool websites about knitting being used as an espionage tool. So that should be fun to talk about. And I, of course, have the giveaway winner for the beautiful Shetland Wool Adventures journal, so stay around to the end and you'll find out who won this guy. So I'm going to jump in with Meirg. It's spelled M-E-I-R-G, but I believe it's pronounced Meirg. And this is a beautiful cardigan that was designed by Albina of LB Handknits. And like I said, I finished it last spring because originally it came out in Life in the Long Grass, which was, I think this was one of their first publications, Through the Trees, which is a beautiful, big, colorful, gorgeous magazine with patterns, and here's Meirg. So it's just a really cool, wardrobe staple cardigan. Beautiful lines. It seems kind of simple in its design, but it has a lot of really nice elements to it, so I want to talk to you about a few of those today. So I knit this up in, first things first, in the Debbie Bliss Fine Donegal Tweed yarn, and here's my swatch. I'll show you that up close. So it's a beautiful singles yarn that has tweedy bits in it, and you can see I started my swatch kind of large and decided I didn't need that big of a swatch, so I went down to a more normal size swatch, and this is what the yarn looks like in its balled up singles knit form. So it is a singles, which means that you have to be a little bit gentle with it if you're working with it. And I'll show you right here. When you're working with a singles yarn, it can pop without too much pressure. So you want to be careful as you're tugging on it on your needles and things like that. And a singles yarn for sweaters is always a little bit of a gamble, because if you end up with a hole or wear in certain areas, all you have is that single ply to hold things together. So if something breaks, that's it. You're going to have a hole and you're going to have to patch it immediately. Whereas if you're working with a 2-ply or a 3-ply yarn, and you get a stress, like some place that's getting a little bit of wear, usually two out of the 3 plies are going to hold things together. So working with this yarn for an entire sweater project is a little bit of a gamble, but I think it pays off in terms of the finished product and the kind of drape that this sweater has. It's an incredibly drapey, beautiful, warm, woolly sweater that's very lightweight because it's only this singles yarn. So you have to kind of think about the trade-offs there. This was yarn that Albina sent for me to work with, and so that was one of the reasons I worked with it, but I do love the idea of this kind of drapey fabric that it produces. So that's the yarn choice. The sweater is knit top down, and it has a couple different options depending on whether or not you want to knit a straight bodice or an A-line bodice. And that's something that Albina includes in a lot of her patterns, is this kind of option for shaping. So instead of more traditional shaping of kind of like an hourglass, or shaping that is only limited to a kind of straight bodice where your bust and your hips are assumed to be the same size, Albina often includes an option for an A-line shaping, and I think that's really flattering for a lot of women, because a lot of women have wider hips than bust, even though it's something we don't often talk about, and we often measure our clothes based on our bust as opposed to our hips. And if you have bigger hips than your bust, then you end up sometimes feeling like your sweater is really tight around your hips, and a lot of us don't like that feeling. So the A-line is a nice feature. I went with the straight version of this sweater, the straight bodice, in part because of the way this yarn drapes and kind of gives more fluidity to the garment, so I didn't feel like it was going to be constrictive at the waist, at the hips when I knit down to do the ribbing. So I just left it without the A-line. A couple of really cool features about this sweater include the fact that she puts in a half fisherman's rib, and I'm going to try to show it to you here. So the most pronounced place that this happens is on the shoulder of the garment. Let's see if the camera will cooperate. Yeah, there you go. And a half fisherman's rib is kind of a tuck stitch. You're basically picking up a stitch below as you knit, and then you're letting the original stitch kind of fall back behind the material, creating not quite ladders, but this looser, really interesting, kind of corrugated looking fabric, which I quite like. And I just really like this kind of detail. It's almost like the other way you could think about it is almost like a military detail. If you've ever seen those jackets that have the kind of lapels on them, it reminds me of that a little bit, and it's a nice, I don't know, I feel like that area of the shoulder doesn't get quite enough attention in knitting. I think it's a great area for lots of different details and kind of pattern embellishments and things like that. And I should have mentioned, the half fisherman's rib is also extended. I'm going to try to do this again, we'll see. The half fisherman's rib is extended when you pick up for your collar. What I did is try to blend in each of the ribs up into the ribs of the collar, and I think you can see that there. It takes a little bit of trickiness because you want to make sure that you're picking up your stitches for your collar along here the right way, so that you're going to end up with this kind of continuation of one into the other. It's a little bit tricky, but I think it's worth doing, and it produces a really nice finished result, I think. So the fisherman's rib is on the shoulders, it's on the collar, it's on the button bands, and it's on the hem of both the sleeves and the sweater. So there's a nice kind of continuity there, and once you get the hang of this half fisherman's rib stitch, it's really easy to execute. I know, I do recall in the spring when I started working on it, I needed to kind of do a couple different tests to figure out that I was doing it the right way and maybe dropping the right stitch. But once I figured it out, I think it lends itself really nicely to the ribbing all over this sweater, because it just gives it a kind of relaxed feel, but also really nicely finished and kind of like symmetrical all over. So I like that part. One thing I noticed about this yarn in the end, and I'll put some pictures of me wearing the sweater in the cast here so you can see it, but one thing I noticed is that even though I didn't do the A-line shaping, and even though I wanted this to take advantage of that yarn and the kind of drape of the fabric, I did end up feeling like the bottom could have been a little bit more narrowed. So I think if I were to knit this again, I might even take in a little bit of do a little bit of shaping in reverse if I were to use this particular fabric again. Because once you get down to the half fisherman's rib at the bottom, it feels a little bit like it wants to go out a little bit. It wants to be A-line, even though it was not A-line in terms of the number of stitches. So I would probably take it in just a little bit before doing the final hem with the fisherman's rib. But I do like the way it looks, and as you'll see when I put up the pictures, it fits me really well. So maybe it's just a feeling of ease. Some people like a little bit more ease than not, and this one has more ease in the lower part of the sweater than I'm typically used to. And I think I would like it to come in just a little bit, especially in terms of warmth in that area. I don't want it to squeeze my hips, but I want it to be a little bit closer. So that's one thing I would do if I reknit this sweater in this type of yarn, in a lightweight kind of singles yarn that has a little less structure than some of the other yarns you might use. And I'm actually kind of curious to knit this again with something other than a single ply yarn to see what the actual difference might be. It has a really cool technique for the button band, which I think a lot of designers are starting to take advantage of, and that is to say that the button holes are done in a single row, and they're kind of integrated into that single row. So there's not any need to go back. Some buttonholes, you have to do a couple different passes, you have to cast on stitches. There are a bunch of different ways that buttonholes get made, but in this particular pattern, and in a lot of Albina's patterns, the buttonholes are a single pass, and you're doing basically a yarn over to create a hole, but you're doing it in this really nifty way so that it gets reinforced on the other side. It's a trick, and I love it, and I love that part of her pattern. So I think it creates a really nice looking button band and a really nice looking buttonhole that's actually a little bit more integrated into the fabric of the sweater than it doesn't show like some of the other buttonholes that you might create. The buttons I used were actually some beautiful little glass buttons that Albina sent along a long time ago when we were doing some yarn exchanges. Let's see if we can get one on the camera, maybe. They're beautiful little glass flower buttons, and when I finished this cardigan, I was digging through my button stash and I was like, oh, those would be absolutely perfect. So they're really kind of cute. I think they're the right color. I think they're the right size, just everything about them just seemed to work, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. And of course, Spencer is my sewing man, so he put the buttons on. He puts the buttons on all my sweaters, and I just love that. So I actually used actually less than 3 balls of the Debbie Bliss Fine Donegal. This is what was left over of my 3rd ball of yarn. So this sweater really, I mean, it's a fine yarn, and it's a full-length sweater. It's not a cropped sweater at all. But I was able to make this sweater plus my swatch with less than 3 balls of yarn, which I thought was pretty impressive. So yeah, it's a good use of yarn for this particular garment. I'm kind of excited to get this out of storage. I pretty much finished it in the spring, in like about March or April. Right as the pandemic was beginning and the weather was warming up, and I haven't had a chance to wear it yet. So as the days get colder, I think this one will be one that I get to pull out and wear around a lot more. It's totally wearable, and Albina has now released it as an independently published pattern. So you guys can go over on Ravelry and pick it up, and if you're not on Ravelry, you can email her and she will find a way to get the pattern to you as a PDF. So there's lots of options there. And for all of you Knitting the Stash folks, I have a coupon code for you, and it's KTS40, and that, well, I'll put it on the screen here, and that will get you 40% off the pattern. Albina was cool enough to send along a little code for us so that if you guys are interested in picking up this pattern, you can do so at 40% off. Yay! So thanks, Albina, for another beautiful sweater. And I actually have one more of her sweaters. These were the 2 that I told you about a while ago that I'd finished and that I couldn't talk to you about because they weren't released yet. So I have Brighter over in the sweater bin, and I'll talk about that one on the next podcast if you're interested in learning more about that particular design by LB Handknits. Yeah. So I'm going to do a quick model switch so I can talk about some in-progress knitting, and I'll be right back. Voila! So when last we met on episode 87, I told you that I was working on a new sweater and a new sweater design, and I introduced you guys to this little beauty here, which basically right now is called mohair in my notes because I don't have a name for it yet. So if you have name suggestions, I'd love to hear them. And in the last episode, I had basically knit up to the armpits, or right up to here on the bust and the front. I had completed the back, so you were able to see the back portion of the sweater. It looked kind of like that. And since then, what I've done is finished the front. I decided on a V-neck, and so this is what the V-neck is going to look like. Of course, it'll have a collar put on here, so it will be less of a deep V-neck than it appears to be right here on the model. So one of the reasons I wanted to bring mohair back out here is because I think in the recent past, I haven't done as good of a job in terms of talking about in-progress knitting and in-progress designing. And those are two things that when I was an early knitter, a beginning knitter, were so helpful to me to hear people talk about their knitting in progress, to see photos of things in progress, and by examining those things, the photos, kind of like zooming in on them or going through a bunch of Ravelry project pages or things like that, I was able to learn a lot more about how knitting works and about how to modify things and how to change things. So I thought, well, this might be a good place to bring a good piece to kind of bring back into the podcast, so that you guys, if you're interested in that kind of thing, can see how my mind is working and how knitting in progress can look very different from the finished objects, because you see things about the garment that you might not see in a finished kind of version. So as I said, I was, right up about the armpits, bust length on the front, and I was contemplating what was going to happen in the front of the sweater. And I knew that I wanted to have the sleeves completed in a different color, in basically one of the threads. This is mohair, and this held double in here, and I wanted to just use the darker kind of gray wool for the sleeves. So thinking about that, I thought, I don't want the mohair to overwhelm everything. And if I went all the way up here with a crew neck, there's a chance that the mohair just becomes too much here in the center torso, even though I've got this cool contrast going on with the hem and the collar and the sleeves. So I decided on a V-neck, and I was trying to also then think about what rate of decrease I wanted for the V-neck. And in this case, I went with pretty much every other row, whereas some V-necks will go every fourth row, and that would create a steeper V this way, right? Less open. So if you go every other row, you end up with a more open V, and if you go every fourth row, let's say every third row, you'd end up with I guess you couldn't do it every third row. But if you go every fourth row, you end up with a smaller V. Things like, what do you do with the extra stitch in the center here that I've got marked off, you might have noticed. That is going to be key to creating a really nice finished look for the V-neck. So there will be like a center double decrease kind of an idea right up here, because you're going to have two sets of collar stitches coming together, and to make it kind of neat, we're going to end up using this stitch and a kind of center double decrease method to create a nice line right here. So thinking about those kinds of things, I thought it might be useful to just talk about them a little bit on the cast. So that's how I ended up doing the front. And I was also thinking, when you're doing a design for the front and the back of a sweater, you're thinking about the width here at the armpits or the bust, and then the necessary width here at the shoulders. And you're thinking about how many stitches need to be decreased, how many stitches you want to maintain up at your neckline. So all of those things were in play. And as I was working on the V-neck, I had to decide, when I halved my stitches here, how many I wanted to end up with at the shoulder. And then I needed a rate of decrease that was going to give me both the V-neck and the right number of stitches up at the shoulder. So these are all different considerations that were going on. Plus, what I wanted to do, as I showed you last time, is to create a little bit of a faux saddle shoulder here by switching from the blended mohair. Let's see if the camera can pick it up a little better. By switching from the blended mohair to this single strand of the Green Mountain Spinnery yarn on either side, on the back and on the front, so that when I did my 3-needle bind off here, it looks a little bit like a saddle shoulder, and I thought that might be nice in terms of integrating this color in the sleeve into the sweater. So all of that is going on in my mind, and then I started dealing with the sleeves, and as you can see, they're not finished. I actually have waste yarn in this guy, and this guy has needles in there. So the reason for that is kind of a good one and a bad one. As I was knitting, I knew I was going to run out of this yarn. Now I've used this yarn before for sweaters, and I generally only need 3 skeins to make a sweater for my size. But I realized as I was getting done with this sleeve that by combining the yarn with the mohair and by giving it a little bit of a longer feel to the sweater, I think it ended up using more yardage than I had first expected. So when I got to this point in the sleeve, I measured the yarn that I had left in my yarn cake, and I had about half the weight of the skein. So I knew that it was gonna get dicey if I was gonna try to buy another skein, integrate the colors, and do another sleeve. So at that point I decided to pull this off, put it on waste yarn, and use the remainder of the ball of yarn, the skein of yarn that I had, to do as much of the other sleeve as possible. Now the thinking there is that if I need to integrate another skein of yarn, which I know I will need to do, that skein of yarn may or may not be exactly the same, because color lots of yarn are slightly different, you know, like it's not always exactly this gray when you buy another skein of yarn at a later date. So by having both sleeves be relatively the same length in the same color yarn, that leaves me with some options. So as I get down here, I could either go with a 3/4 length cuff. I could do the cuff in a kind of variety of mohair or this color, different kinds of striping, different kinds of patterning, like that fisherman's half fisherman's rib kind of a thing. You could use some extra patterning to your advantage there to kind of hide the fact that the new yarn might not be exactly the same as the old yarn, because down here at the end, toward the end of a cuff, is a place where you might expect a little bit of design work, you might expect a little bit of variation anyway. So by leaving that place as the place where that might happen, I thought was safer than just completing the sleeve, putting on the collar, and then just starting another sleeve with a maybe potentially completely different color yarn. That's my thinking. So my hope is that when the yarn arrives, it's pretty close to this, and I can do a little bit of monkey business and decide if maybe it's a 3/4 length sleeve, maybe it's a blend of mohair, maybe it's some patterning to kind of take care of that difference. And the difference here won't be super noticeable, because the difference in color lots between yarns is usually pretty slight. And if it's not right up against the other yarn, you don't notice it quite as much. So this has enough space between the sleeve and the mohair and the collar that if this is a slightly different color lot than the sleeves, it should be okay as well. Plus that gives me a little more leeway in terms of how much yarn I want to use for this collar around the v-neck. If I want it to be a little bit bigger and thicker, if I want it to be, say, 1 inch or even 1.5 inches, probably more like 1 inch, I'll have plenty of yarn to work with rather than trying to scrimp and save on the sleeves and then have, you know, something that feels a little bit less finished up here. Now the nice thing about this sweater, I have to say, is that I was using a kind of integrated, this is from, I think Coco Knits has a great tutorial on integrating your decreases into your actual knitting, and I think you can see that here. The nice thing about this is that the actual edge is pretty darn beautiful and has a really kind of finished look to it, because I did my decreases 1 stitch in from the edge. So my decreases are actually happening here, and they're shaped. So on one side I did knit 2 together, and on the other I did a slip slip knit. So the decreases are shaped, which lends them, they kind of lean in the right direction, and they're away from the edge. So if I needed to, I could leave this. I won't, but if I needed to, at least it has a really kind of nice finished edge on the front here. So the other thing that's happening is, I told you last time about my swatch, which was this guy, and I could recuperate some of this yarn from the swatch if I really absolutely needed it. But this is the Green Mountain Spinnery. This is the Green Mountain Spinnery mixed with the King mohair, and this is just the straight up mohair. And I had originally had a plan to do some of this kind of in the sleeve, give it a different kind of look, and I just couldn't quite figure that out yet. So if anything, I'll integrate some mohair into the sleeve, this part of the swatch into the sleeve, if I need to, especially down around the cuff, but otherwise I couldn't really think of a good space to do it. The other option would be with a V-neck. You could do a cool kind of mohair thing right in the center of your triangle. I'm not really doing it justice here, but you could do a mohair thing kind of as filler if you had a really deep V-neck. You could do a really pretty, like, lacy mohair kind of a thing as a filler in the V-neck, which would give the sweater a very different look. So those are all still on the table. I'm not sure where I'll end up with that. But so far, I really quite like the way this is turning out. I like the different color sleeves with the mohair fabric. I'm glad I didn't go with the raglan yoke shaping. I kind of like this look of the short row capped sleeves. So they're not set-in sleeves, but they look a little bit like set-in sleeves, and I really love that technique. I have a video up about it on YouTube if you're interested in checking that out and you haven't already. But it's one of my favorite techniques. So you basically pick up stitches around the armhole, and then you work your short rows right over the shoulder, and then basically you just knit after that and do your decreases, and it's just like a really nice integrated sleeve. So it's one of my favorites. Yeah. So I like the way this is turning out. There's just a lot of different choices yet to be made, and we'll have to see what happens with the extra skein of yarn that shows up. But it's sitting here right now in stasis and in progress, and I thought it was worth talking about with you guys what it's like to be in process and to be making those kinds of decisions as you go along with the design. I know there are some designers who write out a pattern for themselves, and I talk about this in the Better Sweater series. Some designers actually just write the pattern out without ever knitting anything, and then they try to knit from their pattern to see what they get, if they get what they're expecting or what they're hoping for, and if they like the results. I'm more of a plan ahead in terms of gauge, in terms of general design, in terms of, you know, the basics of the garment, so you don't knit yourself into a corner. But I also am totally willing to kind of change things as I go along and modify and think and see if what I've got is what I like. And then in the end, you have a pattern that you've written up, and you're probably better off actually knitting from that pattern and creating a second one, or that's what good test knitters are for, to see if the pattern that you've written recreates the thing that you've created. So it's a process, and I'm quite enjoying it. I hope it's enjoyable for you guys to see it come along, and hopefully this sweater will be done sooner than later, and then I can finalize the pattern, writing, and get it set for some test knitting and get it sized, graded, so that it can go for a bunch of different sizes. Yeah. So the last segment of the podcast today, before the quick giveaway, is a knitting history segment. And this one is brought to you by a couple of viewers. And most recently, Ruth Smith sent me a great article about knitting and espionage. And someone else sent me another article from Atlas Obscura, and I cannot find the reference. So if you were the one who sent me that article, please let me know so that I can give you credit here, at least over in the show notes. So a couple of you, like I said, sent in these really cool articles about knitting and espionage, and it was actually called Steganography. I think I got that right. And it's been a kind of practice for, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of years, where basically messages were hidden secret messages were encapsulated in ordinary things, not just in knitting, but in plenty of other ordinary everyday objects. But during World War I and World War II, knitting was used in particular. It was also used apparently in the Revolutionary War and the French Revolution and other wars before that, but I'm going to focus on World War I and World War II here, because those were the heart of the articles that were sent to me. And I'll link to the articles over in the show notes so that you can read them for yourselves. So basically, during World War I, there was a move to kind of get primarily older women knitters to sit and look very innocuous, but maybe sit by a train station and use their knitting, the purls and the knit stitches, to create, or dropped stitches, to create a kind of code or a record of, let's say, which trains came by, what kind of trains, if they were German trains, you know, that kind of thing. So there might be women kind of sitting at the train stations, knitting along and creating these records that they could then pass off to the military to let them know what was going on. Now, during World War II, there was also a lot of course, knitting for soldiers and women knitting for socks and sweaters and hats and things like that. There's a big Red Cross movement, right? Many of you know about that. What I didn't know was that there was also a lot of knitting being used to pass information along, and because of that, because of the fear that knitting was being used to pass information along, the US and the UK both banned the printing and posting of written knitting patterns during that period. So, you know, if you look at an older knitting pattern, especially before charts came into fashion, they were often these very cryptic. I think I showed one on Instagram a long time ago. I'll try to find it and put it up in here. That had like the popcorn stitch in it, and it's almost indecipherable. It looks just like ones and zeros. It looks like code. It's kind of an amazing thing to see, and I remember knitting from patterns like that when I first started knitting, and it's very difficult to kind of keep your place. Whereas with a chart, you can kind of see it, you can mark where you are, you kind of visualize it. Anyway, knitting patterns were much more of this kind of coded language, and so there was a fear that if knitting patterns were posted or printed that they could be used in that way, and that if you weren't a knitter, it's hard to decipher that, and it looks like code. It looks like a dangerous thing. I love that idea, knitting patterns as dangerous. So knitting patterns were banned in the UK and the US, and so you couldn't stop the knitting, but you could stop the distribution of that information, which I think probably, I'd be really curious to know, but I think that probably led to a certain sense or generation of knitters who were knitting by eye or by oral tradition or by passed down garments and things like that. That's always been a tradition in certain cultures, but I'm guessing that the prohibition against knitting patterns being printed and posted may have kind of nudged that kind of knitting forward a little bit. Yeah. So in some of the articles that were sent to me, thank you so much, you guys, there was one really great story about a British spy named Phyllis Latour Doyle, who apparently parachuted into Normandy, and she had a bunch of codes hidden in her knitting. She had a string of silk that she had tied knots in and things to create codes for herself so that she'd know what they were. And she would talk to the Germans. She had, you know, would just appear like a teenager wandering around and, you know, seeming fairly innocuous. And she ended up being able to send 135 coded messages back to help free Normandy from the Germans, which I think is kind of cool. She had over 2,000 codes hidden in her knitting, and she was able to send back 135 coded messages. So, way to go, Phyllis. Yeah, and there's so many other stories like that out there. They're in these articles that you guys sent me. They're chock full of really amazing women and probably men doing this kind of work. So I will post them in the show notes, and if you're interested in learning more about knitting and espionage and Steganography, I think I got it there, it could be a fun project for you to go look into and maybe share more with us in our knitting history thread over on Ravelry. So I'd love to hear some more from you guys. And if you were the other person who sent me the knitting as espionage tool article, please let me know who you were so that I can credit you over in the show notes. Yeah. So I think that's it for today, with the exception of the giveaway. So, Amanda, as I said in the last episode, sent this beautiful Shetland Wool Adventures journal. This is volume 1, and it has just come back in stock at the Woolly Thistle, which is in the United States our kind of importer for all things UK, Europe, knitting-wise. And this journal was created by Misa Hay, and I talked about it a little bit last time. I won't belabor that point too much now, but it is in digital form and in print form, and it is full of really fun stories about place and making and recipes and patterns, and it's gorgeous. And this copy is going to Cindy Dell, who wrote in on the last YouTube episode on the comments, and I asked you guys where you would travel, if you could travel anywhere after the pandemic, and Cindy said she wanted to go visit the village where her grandmother was born in the West Norway fjords. It sounds like a great trip to me. So Cindy, congratulations on winning this journal. If you send me your address at knittingthestash@gmail.com, I will pop this in the post to you. Thanks to everyone who sent in wonderful ideas about travel and knitting, and it was just kind of refreshing to imagine a world where we're all post-pandemic and able to travel again and have more normalcy in life. Yeah, it was nice to imagine it. So thank you all for tuning in today. I hope to see you next time, and hopefully on the next one, this guy will be getting closer and closer. If you have name ideas, name suggestions for mohair, let me know. Otherwise, I wish you well, and I will see you in the next couple of weeks. Take good care.